Welcome to Beyond the Grave, where darkness and the unknown collide. Join us on a spine-tingling journey through the chilling realms of the supernatural. Prepare to be haunted by eerie tales, ghostly encounters, and the unexplained mysteries that lurk in the shadows. Subscribe now, if you dare, and let's unravel the secrets that lie beyond the grave together. Hope you would enjoy the 1-hour scary story compilation on our channel. Subscribe our channel, and press the bell icon for more disturbing and chilling scary stories. I do not know where to start. Usually, this would not be written for someone to read. However, I cannot trust my own judgment. What I write here is for you to discern. I will not have sufficient time to thoroughly document everything, nor is it the true intention for this to be a piece of entertainment. I am only interested in understanding myself through your eyes. However, I will provide the most succinct but nondescript introduction to myself. A young lady, surnamed Zorro. Although not indicative of my actual name, it will be a substitute because of its anonymous connotations. I graduated recently, am currently without a job, and am staying in a small apartment with my mother. Around me is really the most ordinary life, and that is why I tend to excite this cycle with new habits. I would sometimes learn the most bizarre skills, isolate myself for a day, which is a form of meditation, and literally anything to do with science. I am unsure whether it is worth mentioning that I used to play volleyball. Nonetheless, such personalities are still considered ordinary. The most peculiar would be the occasional seclusion, but activities such as playing video games for a day are no different and are prominent in Japan. The word for it, I believe, is hikikomori. In my defense, my life was no different from anyone else's, and none of the things I mentioned should be a reason to be considered odd. One important fact I recall is that I possessed a hefty, aspen white wooden box containing the valuables of my life. The container would fit my jewelry, small sculptures, and a Yatagan switchblade, amongst other stray artifacts. The knife was bequeathed without notice, lacking an explanation too. The rich sable handle is dense with power and antiquity. Insignificant pieces were renounced for less transportable cardboard boxes, omitting the shovel. The gardening tool was too protrusive to be enclosed, and it was an eyesore anywhere that was luridly visible. Instead, they are typically tessellated into the cramped kitchen to access a passage for walking. My parents had separated just recently too, into respective apartments and auctioning the long-standing home. They partitioned the possessions to detach the dying memories. The father was determined to immigrate, and the mother would remain. Having not yet flown the coop, I could only reside with one. I love them both dearly, but I will not disclose the reasons for my verdict. Circumstances currently mean that the apartment will be a short drive from the former home. Ideally, I wish to live with both of my parents and never depart our old home. The reality of the situation, however, was grim with misfortune. The possibility of a miraculous happy ending was a child's fantasy. Repressing my depression evolved into a habit, fostering my isolation and addiction. I can carelessly admit that it is an addiction as I confess this to strangers, but addressing this to people I know is a terrifying notion, which is why I want to be alone. There is a particular quote by Pythagoras: "Silence is better than unmeaning words." It is ironic, however, that the quietest people will eventually become the least meaningful, because the quietest people are dead. Although, if his quote could come true, family dinners would have been much quieter. I will continue the remainder of this recount with events that followed the first night of moving out. The day's proceedings were unexpectedly disappointing and unproductive. Father insisted on a well-rested night in the old home. Father resided in the master, mother in the guest, and myself in my original bedroom. Before sleep, I maintain a routine to journal the thoughts and experiences of the day. Often, this could occupy up to an hour due to becoming so immersed. The reason is not to produce a diary, but to develop a lucid dream state. I become the author of my own reality, building a consciousness to instinctively seize awareness. They are rare, the lucid dreams. sometimes residing somewhere in the chasm between reality, a very sharp reality, but outside of my control. These were the hybrid dreams, waking from a world so surreal that you became depersonalized. However, as rare as they are, successful lucid dreams are worth the endeavor. I succumbed to sleep after an excess of hours had overtaken midnight, but my mind could not help but overthink the situation, urging a lucid dream while straining to relax. My concentration to ease myself always backfires, causing my hearing to become acute and uncontrollably diverge with every inconsistent sound. That night, the noise that stood out was a barely audible but steady thud outside my room. I could only comprehend the sound as the dampened and cautious creeping of one of my parents. Who was it? What were they doing this late? Where were they going? Generally, I can differentiate between a mother and a father by their personalities, and the resonance of what type of shoe it was. I would presume the majority are able to identify their parents similarly, but it is impossible when the culprit consciously masks their footsteps. The footsteps halted with the cautious squeaking of a door handle twisting, following the coarse brush between the door and the frame. The air surrounding me cooled as goosebumps swelled, the front door welcoming in the breeze. The struggle to sleep beyond this point was intolerable. I recall straining from the effort of rising from my bed. Despite the chill, I would never wear my slippers to bed. Past creeping experience taught me that the bare foot makes the least noise. I investigated outside my room, wheezing more gusts through my door. The front door was ajar. I silently trotted to the door, giving it a shut and lock. I remember a creeping sense of panic suddenly, the fear of something supernatural. I returned to my room more hastily than I came, burrowing under quilts before I could realize it. The delayed adrenaline rush whispered visions from the darkness into my ear. My toes had been cursed by the cold, adamantly far from the reach of my protection, and skimming the empty shadows. I wrenched the blankets tight, waiting until the fear became numb. There were no dreams that night. I rose uncomfortably early that morning, contradicting my habit as a midday snoozer. I instinctively spent a few minutes prodding my phone, forcibly tuning my eyes to brightness. The events of the previous night would leak into my attention, tugging my curiosity out of bed. Who was it that opened the door last night? I crept to my mother's room fast before my toes scalded from morning floor frostbite. Before the guest room, I knocked politely. After an unanticipated reply, I entered to witness Mother sliding frayed paperbacks into corrugated boxes, distorted by the infused petrichor. My question regarding the incident last night received a denial from my mother. Her veiled, reddish eyes blushed from hours of anguish. I offered to help, but she assured me that help was not needed. Mother later departed to transport a crowded sedan to the apartment, consigning me to the thrilling onus of stuffing a bin liner with scrap. Ultimately, my boredom sidetracked me into a nostalgia hunt. Under mattresses, beyond bookshelves, and finally, the broom covered my gaze dropped to greet a handle, extending downward to behold a spade. Was this always here? It struck me as peculiar to forget and misplace obvious belongings. Was this mine? Without a doubt, adjusting the shovel revealed a chest slotted behind. Jewelry, small sculptures, and a Yadigan switchblade, amongst other stray artifacts inside. Bizarre. Ambivalently, this was a query for the mother or father to resolve. I would later neglect this, chasing treasures and trash instead. Fatigued by night, I struggled in my lucid dream journal with half a fluttering eye open. Each yawn brushed away the opportunity to faint at any moment. A snap shocked me with alertness, perhaps a pencil dropped or from outside. I concluded the vein in writing by expending the limited supply of concentration left. I stretched to switch off the light, bruising the room with patches of shadow and gray. Eyes no longer straining to shade bright reflections, I sought my bed through flickers of phosphine. A night sky beamed a moment of tranquility through the pane. It was silent. My heart rate climbed with anxiety. My breathing grew audible, hastening the panic. I felt dread at that moment, a fervent terror, a terror unlike anything I had ever experienced. I know times where I am frightened by a barking dog or by someone jumping out, but this was different because there was nothing there. A quote surfaced in my imagination. Fear is wisdom in the face of danger. I panicked because where was the danger? Paranoia. Despite being in the safety of my own familiar home, I had never felt so vulnerable. I collapsed the blinds, bolted the door, and threw myself underneath the thin blanket. I have no memory of falling asleep, but I remember the dream. The clear memory of surreal reality. I stood in the middle of the living room. I saw my mother sleeping on the last couch in the barely furnished room. The white chest is beside her arm. The beginning of a ritual, all details sharpened, my senses honed, and I was aware of the wind's pulse and the floor's gravity. The room grew in clarity, breathing fear into my imagination. It sensed my distress and throbbed in reply. The realization of my peril in the present, in this state, it was the chasm before the summit of lucid dreams, producing the nightmare that I could not command. I glanced skyward, an unending depth to the starless sky. Outside, from a third-person perspective, I witnessed myself. I watched myself poised by my mother. Beside us were the wooden chest, the knife, and the shallow hole that was dug. I pressed the knife against her throat, focused hard on the pace, the weight. Gently, the blade bore deeper, splitting skin and being enveloped by flesh. There was no gush of blood, and there was no hesitation in the hand either. The head jerked. The spine was severed. Pause to witness the deafening silence. Nothing stirred. The blade scraped against the cross-section, burnishing the bone from gristle and rutted flesh. My hand caressed her cheek, watchfully clearing the hair from obscuring the eyes. The stare, peering beyond me, bullishly at heaven, dwelling amongst the clouds, one hand supporting behind the crown, the other opening the chest, emptied of its treasure. Mother's head, now nested in her vindictive prison, was lowered gently into the dirt cavern. The body had vanished. It was done. I peeled open my eyes, staring into where I stopped writing last night. I realized that I was seated upright at my desk, the bedsheets undisturbed upon my bed, having not been used last night. The blinds were not closed, despite my memory of doing so. My eyes were damp and scared, recognizing only the ache in my heart from exhaustion. Was it me who opened that door the first night? Did I unconsciously take the shovel and knife? Did I awaken my own Mr. Hyde through experimenting with lucid dreams? From here on, I am writing in the present. I fear everything. I am scared that I can no longer differentiate between reality and imagination. I am afraid of what I have provoked, seeking an escape from reality through dreams. I am scared of myself. I can no longer trust myself. When I look outside my window, I can see the muddy trench from the dream. It is real. The box is there too. There is so much blood that it is no longer its former patchy white. It is real. Am I crazy? What is real? This journal is almost at its end. Anything written here is meaningless. My father has been knocking on my door. Father is concerned for me, but he does not yet know what I have committed. I plan to run away when I open the door. I will have to open it soon. He is still pleading with me, talking obliviously about how irresponsible it is to leave my belongings in the broom cupboard and for me to leave dirty slippers lying around. But he does not know that I murdered my own mother. He wants the door open. Did I do this? Do you believe me? Am I crazy? I enjoy running quite a bit. It might come off as a bit odd to say, but it really is important to me. I found my love for it back in high school, when I ended up drifting aimlessly onto the cross-country track teams. Joining was less of an active choice on my part, and more of a settling. My parents wanted me to be more like my football and academic all-star brother, and I just wanted them off my back. Running seemed like the easiest choice. It was less of a skill-based sport and more of a test of endurance, which is something I thought I had plenty of given all the hour-long lectures I've sat through. Of course, it wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. Much like any sport, it required a lot of dedication and hard work. Blood, sweat, and tears, and all that jazz given my general attitude towards life at the time. Most would expect that to put me off. But surprisingly, it didn't. I loved it. It was less about racing, competing, and all that and more about the simple act of running, of just getting out there and moving your body. It was really hard at first when you had to build up your stamina and become capable of running long distances. However, the feeling of your body improving and being able to go farther for longer is very satisfying. Plus, just having that ability to run miles and miles is incredibly freeing in a way. Something about being able to travel without relying on anything but yourself was a very positive factor in building up my self-worth. Having a more reliable body made me feel like a more reliable, complete person. By the time graduation came around, it was a part of my identity. If there was one part of it that I wasn't particularly fond of, it would be the occasionally nasty weather. In particular, timing a run outdoors during the summer can be a bit of a pain. When it comes to spring or fall, you can pretty much go out for a run whenever. For winter, it's less about timing and more about conditions. You can always bundle up a bit to keep the cold at bay. But whether or not surfaces will be icy or covered in thick layers of snow is definitely something to be concerned about. However, in no season are your windows for going out for a run more limited than during the summer months. If you live in an area where you have comparatively mild summers, this may not be the case for you. However, if you live in an area where the temperatures often go above 100 degrees Fahrenheit and death from heat stroke is a common occurrence, then you're probably able to relate. In weather like that, if you want to manage a run outside, you either need to go out in the early morning or late evening, or just find a decently shaded area and hope for the best. Sure, you could just go to an air-conditioned gym and run on a treadmill, but it just isn't quite the same, you know. Thankfully, when it came time for college, I ended up at one with a beautiful campus with extensive jogging and bike paths, which were in a well-shaded forested area. On top of that, my schedule ended up organized in such a way that I had plenty of time free in the mornings and evenings on most days. Overall, I was in pretty good shape to be able to run outside in any season, even on the hottest days of summer. If it weren't for what happened that day, it would have been perfect. I was a bit late getting out of the dorm for my run that evening. I had to meet with my professor after class to go over my plan for the final project, and the meeting ended up running a bit late. It was getting close to sunset by the time I got back from class and finished changing into my workout gear, but I decided to go out on a run anyway. Missing a day was a bit of a pet peeve of mine, and I figured that if I ran quickly enough, I'd be able to make it back before the sun set completely. I was right about that. I did manage to get back before the sun finished dipping below the horizon. However, there was one thing that I neglected to factor in, that, in dense woods, it would start to get really dark long before the sun set completely. I was about halfway through the last leg of my 6-mile loop when it really started to set in. I could barely see my own feet hit the pavement, let alone the path ahead. It was then that I realized my mistake. However, I was well beyond being able to do much about it. I was about 1.5 miles away from getting back to the relatively well-lit campus, but it wasn't like there was a way for me to cut the run short at that point. I was already on the quickest way back. The most I could do was run a bit faster. Sighing, I picked up my pace a bit, hoping that I could make it back to campus before I lost all traces of light. I wished then that I hadn't left all my devices at home and opted to enjoy the sounds of nature rather than music. At least then I could have had something to light my path. Unfortunately, I didn't quite make it. When I was still about 1/2 mile out, the forest had finally become pitch black, without even the light of the moon piercing through the thick canopy. I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my face. I didn't really mind it so much, though. It did feel a bit unnerving, but running without sight was also a fun new experience. Sort of like showering with the bathroom lights off. Sure, running in the dark was a lot riskier in comparison, but the maintenance staff did a good job of keeping the trails clear, so I was in little danger of tripping. Also, at that point, it was pretty much a straight shot to campus. I felt relatively safe. That is, until I wasn't. It came upon me as a sort of feeling, a general sense of something being amiss. I was more or less certain that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. All the same, though, I certainly wasn't having fun anymore. 4 miles left. I found myself shivering a bit, and not because of the cold. I found myself thinking back on the time I wet myself in a haunted house at 5 years old. The pure sense of fear that I felt back then in that moment seemed deeply similar to what was presently creeping up my spine as I ran through those woods. The rapid beating of my heart, already quickened by the exercise, pushed fearful adrenaline through my system ever quicker. I picked up the pace. 3 miles left. I almost couldn't hear the sound of the branch snapping over the pounding of my heart and the rush of my breath. It came from somewhere off in the woods behind me and to my left. It was a perfectly normal sound to hear in the woods, completely innocuous. Probably just a small animal in the underbrush. However, being as anxiety-ridden as I was in that moment, it may as well have been a gunshot. Reason was leaking rapidly from my mind. I felt certain that whatever had made that noise was coming for me. I was running full tilt now. 2 miles left. I heard a second set of footfalls. Where once it was just the rhythmic smacking of my sneakers against the pavement, suddenly there was an accompaniment. It seemed that whoever or whatever was behind me was trying to match my pace as best as they could, but it was ever so slightly offbeat. The sound seemed to be getting closer. I broke into a dead sprint. So did they, dropping any pretense of stealth. 1 miles left. I could see the exit, where the last of the trees parted, giving way to the well-manicured lawns of the campus grounds. It was so very close, a distance I could cover in less than a minute at a light jog. I couldn't take much comfort in that, though. Whatever was chasing me was right at my heels. They were so close that they might have been able to reach out and touch me. With this proximity, I started to notice things. Little details that seemed to only terrify me further. The scrape of claws against pavement with every step. A wet stench of rotting meat. A breath of hot air that coated my back in vile humidity. I was just a few more strides away from escape, but those last steps might as well have been a marathon. I felt like a rabbit, desperately trying to outpace a set of ravenous jaws. It was so close. 3 steps. 2. 1. I broke free of the woods, losing my balance and tumbling off the path and into the grass as I went. Stunned, it took me a few moments before I scrambled to my feet, fearful of whatever had been chasing me following me into the light. But there was nothing there. Nothing but the pitch-black entrance to the trails. The way the light hit the trees made it seem almost like a dark tunnel leading into the depths of a mountain or the great gaping maw of some massive beast. Intimidating, yet harmless. Whatever had been chasing me was gone. Perhaps it was never even there. I stumbled to my feet, out of breath yet full of relief. I chuckled a bit to myself and glanced about, thankful to find that no one was around to catch sight of my foolishness. Having fully convinced myself that I had simply imagined the whole thing, I headed off towards my dorm at a limping jog. It felt like I had pulled a calf muscle during my tumble. It wasn't until I got back to my dorm room and started stripping down for a shower that I saw them. A series of small, thin incisions in my right calf. Arranged in the shape of a semicircle, they were about an inch deep and steadily oozing blood. It was almost as if I had been bitten by a small shark with a mouth full of razor blades. With that incident, in addition to the several disappearances that occurred out in those woods over the next few years, I was pretty much done with running on those trails. I stuck to using the treadmills at the school gym for the rest of my time at that college, even during daylight hours. It just felt safer that way. Maplewood Academy stood as a monument to education, elegance, and prestige. Nestled in the secluded town of Elmdale, it was a place where the nation's brightest young minds were cultivated. But I was about to discover that beneath the facade of tradition and honor lay secrets dark enough to chill the soul. The academy had a strange allure, which is what drew me to accept the position as an English teacher there. But from the moment I stepped on campus, I felt an unsettling presence. It wasn't just the towering Gothic architecture or the ancient oaks that overshadowed the grounds. There was something more, something lurking in the dark corners of classrooms and whispered about in hushed tones by both teachers and students. The other teachers were an odd bunch, to say the least. Mrs. Alden, the ancient history teacher, whose eyes seemed to pierce through you, never missing anything. Mr. Barnes, the chemistry teacher, who was obsessed with his mysterious experiments, always locked away in his lab. And Miss Sinclair, the beautiful but cold mathematics teacher, who seemed to be hiding something behind her icy gaze. But it was the students who were truly unsettling. They were all exceptionally bright, but there was a darkness in some of them, a shadow that seemed to cling to them, particularly a group of 5 who always stuck together, always whispering, always watching. My first week went smoothly enough, although I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched and that I was an outsider intruding on a well-kept secret. Then the nightmares began. Every night, I would dream of a hidden room in the academy, filled with ancient texts and symbols, where rituals were performed and dark pacts were made. I would wake up in a cold sweat. The images were too vivid to be just a dream. I began to investigate, delving into the academy's history. I found hints of something sinister, a hidden society of teachers and students dating back generations, devoted to something dark and forbidden. The more I dug, the more I was drawn into the web of horror that was Maplewood Academy. The whispers grew louder, the shadows deeper, and I knew that I was getting close to something that should never be uncovered. Then, one night, I stumbled upon the hidden room, just as in my nightmares. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. What I found was beyond comprehension. A room filled with occult symbols and artifacts, evidence of rituals and dark magic. But it was the photographs that truly horrified me. Pictures of students and teachers, all members of the hidden society, all participants in the dark rituals. But it was the last picture that made my blood run cold. It was me, standing among them, smiling, a part of the horror. My mind reeled, the room spinning around me. Was it all a dream? A trick of the mind? Or had I been a part of this all along, my memory erased, my true self hidden? I stumbled out of the room, the world a blur of confusion and terror. The walls of Maplewood Academy closed in around me, and I knew that I was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The dark secrets of Maplewood had claimed me, and I knew that I would never be free. The discovery in the hidden room sent me into a spiraling pit of madness and confusion. My own face in the photographs, smiling amidst the dark rituals, became a haunting image I couldn't escape. Was I a pawn or a willing participant in the twisted games of Maplewood Academy? The teachers, now aware that I had uncovered their secret, grew cold and watchful. The group of 5 students became even more mysterious, their whispers growing louder and their eyes filled with a knowing gleam. I became desperate to uncover the truth, digging deeper into the academy's history and into my own past. I found old records, hidden documents, and journal entries filled with dark prophecies and ancient pacts. And at the center of it all was the hidden society, manipulating events and shaping destinies. My nightmares grew more vivid, filled with visions of blood and sacrifice, voices whispering ancient incantations, and always the hidden room calling me back. I knew that I had to confront them and face the horror head-on. With trembling hands, I gathered evidence, preparing to expose the dark society to the world. But the more I learned, the more I realized that the web of horror reached far beyond Maplewood Academy and into the highest echelons of power and influence. The night of confrontation arrived, And I found myself once again standing before the hidden room's door. Armed with evidence and driven by a determination to end the nightmare, I stepped inside. The room was filled with the Dark Society's members, the creepy teachers, and the group of 5 students, all standing in a circle, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. They turned to me with smiles on their faces, and I knew that they had been expecting me. The truth hit me like a bolt of lightning, and I understood the horrifying reality. I was not an outsider. I was one of them. My memories flooded back, and the veil lifted. I had been a part of the Dark Society. Initiated into their ranks, my mind erased to serve their purpose. I had been chosen, groomed, and prepared for a role I was destined to play. The ritual continued, and I found myself joining in. The words flowing from my lips as if I had spoken them 1,000 times before. The room filled with an otherworldly energy, and I knew that something ancient and powerful was about to be unleashed. The ceremony reached its climax, and I realized that I was the key, the vessel through which the ancient horror would be reborn. The sacrifices, the rituals, and the dark pacts had all led to this moment. The room exploded in darkness, and I felt myself being torn apart, consumed by the terror that I had helped unleash. The world went black, and I knew no more. When I awoke, I was back in my classroom, the evidence gone, the memories fading like a dream. But I knew that something had changed, that I had become something else, something dark and terrible. The teachers and students went about their lives, the secret of Maplewood Academy buried once more. But the horror lived on inside me, waiting for the time to strike again. I had become the very terror I had sought to uncover, a part of the darkness that lurked in the shadows of Maplewood Academy. The nightmare was not over. It had only just begun. The Academy's secrets remained hidden and eternal, and I knew that I would never escape the horror that I had become. The whispers in the dark continued, a constant reminder of the terrifying truth. I was the horror story that would never be forgotten. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest. Now, when I say that it's a small town, I mean that other people from my state have never even heard of it. That being said, for such a small town, it actually has a pretty dark history. In 1927, my hometown was a small village with a population of just over 300 people. The largest employer in the area, the Macmillan Textile Factory, was built in 1922. The location was ideal because of all the available land and the town's close proximity to the state capital. By 1927, the factory employed 314 people from the surrounding area. May 25, 1927, started early just like every other day, and the workers looked forward to the start of a productive summer. But at 8:45 a.m., the north wing of the building exploded. Shortly after the explosion, a man named Arthur Rentschler, a disgruntled former employee, arrived on the scene. He had loaded down his pickup with dynamite and scrap metal from his farm. Eyewitnesses said he stepped out of the truck holding a rifle. When the floor manager approached him, he fired into the bed of the truck, which caused the dynamite to detonate. The explosion of the truck killed Rentschler, the manager, and a few other bystanders. The fire department found another 500 pounds of unexploded dynamite rigged up in the basement of the building and discovered that Rentschler had killed his wife and burned down his home. Investigators also discovered a sign on the property that read, "Criminals are made, not born." In the following weeks of investigation, witnesses came forward making claims that Rentschler had been complaining about a recent tax spike in order to pay for the new area school, and it was further discovered that his farm was in foreclosure. Investigators speculate that the combination of him losing his job and the tax increase may have been the catalyst for the bombing. When all was said and done, 44 people lost their lives. The news covered the bombing heavily, and over the weekend following the attack, some 50,000 people drove through the town just trying to catch a peek of the carnage. Unfortunately, the story rapidly fell by the wayside due to Charles Lindbergh's transatlantic flight, which took place 2 days later. As quickly as it happened, the tragedy and its victims were forgotten. But they don't want to be forgotten. They want us all to remember, and on a balmy summer night in 2008, I learned not to forget. It was the summer before my senior year, and I had been staying at my friend Mike's house for the better part of a week. One night, after what felt like our 1000th match of Halo 3, I was video gamed out. I took off my headset, set the controller down, and looked at Mike. He was furiously rubbing his eyes, which, if they felt anything like mine, were on fire. "Do you want to go outside for a little bit?" I asked. "Dude, I thought you'd never ask," Mike replied with a grin. "It's like 2 a.m. though. Where are we gonna go?" "I really don't care. I just can't look at the TV anymore right now." We decided to take a walk through town. Neither of us planned on doing anything nefarious, but we both agreed that we needed some fresh air. As we walked down the dirt road Mike lived on, we laughed and talked about girls, cars, the rapidly approaching football season, and all the types of things you'd expect from 2 high school seniors. We walked past the high school, the town's only gas station, and then down Main Street. As we walked in front of our small town's only bar, a few girls who had graduated our freshman year stumbled out into the street. Mike and I tried our hardest to talk a big game and impress these girls, but just as you'd imagine, neither of them could have cared any less. Sure that we'd just ruined our only chance of any entertainment for the night, we decided to head back to his house. Our return route had us walking past the site of the old Macmillan factory, and then eventually putting us in front of the town's small cemetery. As we walked in front of the old factory grounds that had since been converted to a small park, Mike spoke. "Why do you think he did it?" Mike asked, suddenly breaking the silence. I turned to look at him. "Why did who do what?" "Rensselaer. Why do you think he blew up the factory?" "You know the story just as well as I do. He was pissed about losing his job and his farm. Pretty straightforward, dude." "No way. There had to be more to it than that. People lose their jobs every day. If I had to guess, it was demonic possession, or maybe he was just insane," Mike said matter-of-factly. I didn't really believe that demons had a hand in the disaster, but I felt a chill run down my back anyway. I looked ahead, saw that we were quickly approaching the town's small cemetery, and felt the chill intensify. Most of the victims had been buried in that cemetery before their families packed up and left town, and with the way our conversation had turned, I wanted to be as far away from it as possible. "Let's cut through the cemetery," Mike said. "It'll cut our walk in half if we go through it." I turned quickly to look at Mike. "Are you insane? I'm not walking through a graveyard at 3 in the morning." That's when Mike said it, the one sentence that will convince a 17-year-old boy to do just about anything. "Don't be such a pussycat, dude." I groaned and said, "Damn it, okay, let's do this." Mike grinned at me before taking a large, exaggerated step off the main road and into the cemetery. I quickly followed suit, and soon we found ourselves deep in the cemetery. The cemetery itself is laid out like a giant, sideways H, and as such is near impossible to get lost in. Or so I thought. As we walked, I began to notice that the area was completely devoid of sound, save for our feet scraping on concrete. Our ears should have been assaulted by the sound of crickets and spring peepers, but instead we were completely engulfed in silence. I turned back to look at the main road we had entered from. It looked impossibly far away, much further than it should have. I turned back to Mike. "Hey, shouldn't we have hit the turn yet?" "I thought so. Maybe the darkness is just throwing us off. Let's keep going. We'll either find the turn or hit the wood line." We walked for another few minutes when I thought I saw a light moving ahead of us. I strained my eyes in the dark, trying to figure out what I was seeing. "Do you see that light up there?" I asked in a hushed whisper. Mike stopped and looked ahead. "I think so. It kind of looks like a flashlight." "Yeah, that's it. Is someone really out there in the woods? It's probably a ghost light, Mike said with a shrug. Just stay on the path, and we'll be fine. What the shit? A ghost light? What are you talking about? I asked. I stopped and waited for Mike to face me. What the hell is a ghost light? Mike stopped and turned to face me. He now stood between me and the tree line, and I could only make out the light if I leaned left or right. There are a few different versions of the story, but the one I've heard the most is that the lights show up as a way to lead you off the trail or pathway in a cemetery. Once you've stepped off the trail, you're in their domain, he said as he gestured to the tombstones on either side of us. Sometimes the lights lead you to bodies, sometimes to some kind of treasure, and other times the lights will lead you to your death. I shivered and swallowed hard. I leaned a little to the right and saw that the light looked closer, or at least bigger. I looked back at Mike. Let's get the hell out of here. It looks like that light is getting closer. Mike turned to look at the light. We both gasped when we realized that not only was the light closer than when we originally saw it, but it was moving straight towards us and picking up speed. I tried to run, but I felt like I was cemented to the ground. The light moved in a straight line. It didn't bounce or move like someone carrying a flashlight. It just shot straight at us. Mike grabbed my arm and snapped me out of my trance as he ran by. Fucking run. I turned and started to run, but soon realized that I had stepped off the path and was now sprinting parallel to the road between the tombstones. I looked to my left and saw that Mike was running in the same direction, just a few rows of tombstones from me. Mike, run to the road, I screamed out. Mike acknowledged me by changing direction mid-stride, but suddenly he dropped. Mike, I yelled as I changed direction and charged towards my friend. As I approached where he had gone down, I saw him holding the right side of his face and frantically scrambling to his feet. Leave me, dude, just go. He panted. No way, come on. I yelled as a bright light began to fall all around us. I threw his arm over my shoulder and half ran and half carried him a few more yards before my foot caught the corner of a low headstone. Mike grunted loudly as we crashed into the damp grass. I frantically rolled over and covered my face. The light had become so blindingly bright that I could no longer keep my eyes open. I felt my body tense up as the light washed over us. And then, nothing. I felt nothing. I had yet to open my eyes, but I could feel my feet planted firmly on the ground. I slowly opened my eyes and looked around. To my right, Mike was doing the same. What the fuck was that? Mike asked. I scanned around and realized that we were back at the front of the cemetery. I looked over at Mike, who was no longer bleeding from his face, before looking down at my watch. It read 5:30 a.m. Somehow, 2.5 hours had passed since we had originally entered the cemetery. I don't know, man. I think we just got chased by a ghost. I mean, I didn't make that up, right? Mike shook his head. No, that definitely just happened. I followed Mike's gaze and gasped when I noticed a man in denim coveralls standing next to the closest tombstone. The man had an almost disgusted look on his face. What felt like an eternity passed as we stared at one another. Finally, the man spoke. Why have you forgotten us? Why has everyone forgotten us? Behind the man, I saw silhouettes materializing and moving closer to us. Please, tell our story. Don't let them forget, the man said as he began to fade from view. One by one, the silhouettes behind him faded as well, and before long, Mike and I were left standing there, mouths agape. Mike, clearly the braver of the two of us, walked back into the cemetery and looked down at the tombstone the man had been standing next to. Robert Ames, born September 9th, 1897, died May 25th, 1927. Mike read slowly before looking up at me. Even in the dark, I could see that the color had drained from his face, and he quickly rejoined me on the road. Neither of us spoke of the incident for months. Both of us avoided the cemetery like the plague. That is, until Community Day. The week before homecoming, the football team adopted the cemetery for Community Day, and we were expected to go as a team to clean up headstones and pick up trash. There was no real way to get out of it, so Mike and I begrudgingly went. The day went surprisingly smoothly, and I had nearly forgotten about the ghost lights and apparitions until I moved near where Mr. Ames was buried. I didn't see anything or anyone, but I swear I heard a voice whisper, "Remember us." It's been almost a decade since we saw the ghost lights, but everywhere I go, I make sure to tell the story of the Macmillan textile factory. A tragedy like that should never be forgotten, and neither should the innocent people who lost their lives.